In it together, the beautiful struggle uniting us all. We can't help starving children because we can't help ourselves. To be fair, it's not clear the degree to which it is can't versus don't. But either way, the result is the same. We don't even help ourselves. Thus, to an extent, it is fair to conclude, for most intents and purposes, we cannot help ourselves, since one would think if we could, we would. It's not extreme selfishness, let alone full-blown psychopathy, that is the cause of our failure to save starving children among needy others, but rather the opposite. It is our self-destructiveness. We may behave cruelly and behave in seemingly unsympathetic ways toward starving children and others who suffer, but it isn't because we selfishly treat them worse than we treat ourselves. The sad opposite is the case. We treat them so cruelly because we treat them like we treat ourselves, which is cruelly. Many children these days are taught something often called the Golden Rule. Treat others how you want to be treated. If we judge the way someone wants to be treated by how they treat themselves, then the seeming problems in the seeming world of problems can be explained simply by an unfortunate following of the Golden Rule. We treat ourselves badly. We are cruel to ourselves. We habitually behave unsympathetically and unlovingly to the very human we see in the mirror. In the USA, official suicide is both one of the leading causes of death for teenagers and for the elderly. And that refers only to situations in which suicide is officially listed as the cause of death on documentation. Documented suicide does not include an alcoholic who dies in a crash while drunk driving. Documented suicide doesn't include most lethal drug overdoses. Documented suicide does not include a lifelong cigarette smoker who dies of lung cancer. If we documented it more accurately, perhaps we'd all be documented as suicidal self-harmers. Even for those of us who find ourselves on the wildly luckier and wildly more luxurious side of this unfair tale of two cities, we still suffer so very deeply, at our own hands, at our own doing. Simple psychopathic selfishness is not what drives an alcoholic to drink himself to death. Simple psychopathic selfishness is not what causes someone with an extreme case of low self-esteem to wake up, look in the mirror and think, if not say aloud to that human in the mirror, "I hate you," or "You're ugly and disgusting." Simple psychopathic selfishness is not what causes a wealthy, neglected trust fund baby to cut her wrists vertically, bleeding out to death by her own hand, crying. Simple psychopathic selfishness is not what causes a morbidly obese person to overeat to death, which quite literally happens many times every day. Obesity is currently one of the leading causes of human death. According to the World Health Organization, nearly 3 million people die every year from obesity. That's over 8,000 human beings per day, killed literally by their own hands, shoveling excessive food down into their own throat. If thousands of innocent children starving to death every day is considered a preventable problem, what irony it is that in this tale of two cities, it is such a similarly common problem for food addicts and sugar addicts to overeat to death. If it isn't food, maybe it's a heroin needle or one too many glasses full of whiskey, presumably consumed by a sad person. A person not only driven to addiction by sadness, but also driven to sadness by addiction, yet unwilling to sacrifice the comfort of that addiction as self-medication for the very misery it exasperates. Addictive objects and behaviors, such as crack cocaine, the object, or the act of smoking it, the behavior, are sometimes called vices, sins, bad habits, or temptations. They can sometimes be referred to with words like short-sighted, indulgent, evil, or unhealthy. The words vary by specific substance, specific behavior, and by the preferences and vernacular of the speaker. Some people prefer some words, some prefer others. A given religious person talking about a certain thing might favor the word sin, while a therapist talking to their own client might prefer the phrase undesirable habit you are struggling to change. As stated earlier, this book seeks not to argue terminology or semantics. Call these things what you want, and vary what you call them as you see fit. Whatever you usually call them, we can agree that they are props in the common human struggle against temptation and misery. I call them many things, but one thing I like to call them is props. In this crazy little play on this crazy little stage called Earth, props seems like an appropriate name. Consider our greed, our overindulgence, our money-addicted materialism, and our gluttony. These are various symptoms and varying words for a shared fundamental quality. Call it what you will. Whatever you call it, it is by itself as problematic as the problems it seems to cause. That underlying, seemingly problematic thing is our self-cruelty and our apparent lack of self-love. Excessive selfishness, such as greedy gluttony, merely exemplifies a deeper pattern of self-destructiveness, temptation caving, and seeming self-hatred, which exists not just between us as individuals and as species, but also, and even more so, within each of us as individuals. The battle is mostly, if not entirely, inside. For those of us who haven't yet killed ourselves with any of the various tempting props and siren songs, including but not limited to those mentioned, we nonetheless use the props to inflict terrible damage and great suffering upon the human we see in the mirror, be it from overeating or anorexia, alcohol or cigarettes, laziness or gym rat egomania, shopaholic-induced credit card debt or gambling addiction, this or that, vice or sin, yours or mine. The enemy is within. I previously quoted the tyrant Stalin, so it is only fair I quote one of the prisoners who suffered in a Soviet gulag under Stalin's rule, a nonviolent criminal who, unlike many of the nonviolent human beings suffered in prison today, was actually guilty of the crime for which he was charged, criticizing Stalin. To that end, I quote a passage from the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being.